Tonight on the podcast review show, we are looking at Podcast Junkies. You can find it at podcastjunkies.com. I'm your host, Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting.com. If you're new to the podcast review show, that's where we basically listen to your podcast from start to finish. We go over your website, we look at your audio quality and tell you what you're doing right so that you can do more of that and find those things that maybe need a little bit of tweaking and give you some constructive feedback on that. Joining me as always is Eric K. Johnson. You might know him as the Podcast Talent Coach. You can find him at podcasttalentcoach.com. Eric, how's it going, buddy?
Things are good, Dave. Things are good. Glad to be back in the saddle again. Glad to be reviewing this show. This one's going to be a fun one.
Yeah, this is joining us is Harry Duran from podcastjunkies.com. Harry, thanks for coming on the show, buddy.
This is I'm already having fun, and we haven't even started.
So your website, podcastjunkies.com, I wonder if I am going to look as a biased reviewer sitting here in my Podcast Junkies t-shirt.
Homer.
But why did you decide to start Podcast Junkies?
I initially, I'm a big fan of electronic music and house music. I grew up DJing. If you can want to see my turntables, I still got them in my vinyl collection.
Nice.
For those on video. So I love like just entertaining people, and I think that's where the passion for music comes from. And then I started a mobile app called Know Your DJ, and then I went to New Media Expo in 2014, and I was going to interview all these world famous globetrotting DJs, and I quickly realized how hard it would be to track them all down. And I was like, there's a podcaster, there's a podcaster, there's a podcaster. I'm like, well, and it was in Cliff Ravenscraft's talk, and Chris Murphy introduced Cliff. And he said, we're all podcast junkies, and my ears just perked up, and I'm like, yeah, I'm a podcast junkie, and that's a nice name. And so I tracked down Chris in the hallway, and I said, what do you think about this idea? Because as every new podcaster, I was like, maybe we'll do it together so I don't have to do it on my own. I was so afraid to even think about doing this on my own. And I just went for it, and he just was a little too busy. And I grabbed Chase Reeves as my first one, and I was off and running. And it's been an amazing ride ever since.
Have you ever had a tough time getting people to come on the show? Have you ever had been at a loss for an interview?
I think in the beginning, Eric, I was unknown in the podcasting world. Thankfully, I took a podcasting course, and I met some friends through there. And when you're new, you just like gravitating to anyone who wants to talk to you. I was asking people to help me test my Skype connection before the first interview. But in the beginning, you're just asking a couple of people who took a chance on me early on, and then you just kind of ask them if they know anyone, and I just went to the places where I knew my guests would be, and in this case it's podcasting conferences. So I met a few at the first one, and I just realized, okay, this is where I need to be, and I need to be in this world. And I know it's a super meta inception rabbit hole, but yeah, I now it's not as hard as it used to be because it's building up to more of a brand. But in the beginning, yeah, I was hustling to just reach out to anyone who wanted to be on the show, who wanted to talk. Initially, the guideline I had was that they had recorded 50 episodes or more, because I felt that's a sign of how serious they were. But yeah, I've been a bit more lax about that, just because I've had some really fun conversations with people who I'm really passionate about their topic and getting their story out there.
No, you've had some great interviews over the 300, some big names too, which has been fun to listen to.
Thank you.
I want to throw one of your questions at you. What have you changed your mind about lately?
It's amazing that I'm not prepared to answer that question. I'll keep it in the podcasting space. I think this really this fascination about trying to get to like certain magic numbers, like thousands of downloads per episode. I have, to be quite honest, sub-1,000 downloads per episode. But by all accounts, been incredibly successful. I've actually built a business now off of it. My company, Fullcast, which came as a result of everything I've learned and connections I've made, and just diving deeper into how I could continue to add value with my podcast as a test bed. And it's just having had these face-to-face conversations over the last 3.5 years, because I made it a point to make sure I had Skype face conversations, even though I wasn't recording or going to use the video. I wanted to use only the audio. And there's just something to be said. We've all had conversations that have been just audio, and you do get a connection, even if it is, for an hour with the person, but it's not the same as the face-to-face. Eric, just this past podcast movement, we were walking in the hallway, and it was just the instant connection because we've had that conversation face-to-face, and he said, "Hey, Harry," and it's just something to be said for that. So it's I for me, it's been a success, and so I've been changing my mind about what I thought initially about what constitutes a successful podcast.
Well, the other thing, that was actually one of my notes, because I know you have the company. Is it just fullcast.com?
Fullcast.co. Haven't made enough money yet to buy
the app.
And what do you do at Fullcast?
So it's a full service podcast production company. And what I wanted to do, Eric, was I started working with businesses who were already doing 6 or 7 figures, and now I've been doing some companies as well. I want it to be everything. So they literally record the episode, they place it in Dropbox or Google Drive, and we pick it up. And they're usually doing Zoom or Skype. We pick it up. If it's Skype, we split up the MOV. We do the editing. We do a full transcription. We write the show notes, timestamps, tweetables. We post the show notes to their website for them. And then we start repurposing their content all across social media. So we have all their logins. So we do Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We post it on Medium. We take the transcription and we repurpose it into captions on YouTube.
Wow.
We send them their download numbers every week. We send them their iTunes reviews every week. And we even write the email that they send to their guest. They just cut and paste it. And so if you had Dave on, be like, "Here, Eric, here's the email you're going to send to Dave." You would just cut and paste it and send it to Dave.
Nice.
When we launch, we create their artwork, we create their voiceover. We have a composer we work with that writes unique music, and we write a press release as well. We submit a press release through PR Newswire. So it's really meant for people, and it's a premium price point. And we recently just a nice client win. We just landed the chief marketing officer of Dun & Bradstreet as a client through a connection here in California. It just happened to be, I saw the DMB domain come through on the email. I was like, could that be the DMB?
Well, that was one of my points I had, and maybe now I think I understand why, because maybe your target audience isn't listening to Podcast Junkies, maybe because you have like 0 call to action at the end of your show, besides your retention hashtag.
Yeah.
Other than that, so how did you grow your business?
So it's interesting. I got a coach. I had a friend of mine tell me recently, if your coach doesn't have a coach, then you need to get a new coach. Because it's a combination of things, Dave. It's the Jim Rohn quote, "You are the sum of the 5 people you most associate yourself with." And it was just ringing in my ears because I was coming out of corporate America and I had my podcasting friends. And so the jump from, the corporate life to podcasting friends was already just a big shift because they had, they were entrepreneurial in nature. But then I realized, how do people make 6 figures, 7 figures online? Who are they? Where do they hang out? So I got a coach. It was $1,500 a month. And I still had my 9-to-5 job. So I basically reinvested that money myself. And I knew I had the podcast skills that were growing and growing. And I was like, how do I do that? How do I create a business out of that? And the program's called Black Belt, and I'm still in it. And it's just been amazing because I realized it was an aha moment. I was doing a workshop session, and instead of just pricing it as a standard podcast editing service for a couple of $100 a month, I was like, man, I'm not going to make any money. I'm just going to be chasing people down for MP3s. That doesn't sound like fun. So I looked around the room and I was like, oh, wait a minute. There's people that pay a premium for a premium service. So I priced it high and I said, let me find out where these people hang out. What conferences do they go to? Who are their coaches? What type of events do they go to? And I just surrounded myself with people who have these high-end masterminds, who need a service like this, and who understand the opportunity cost of paying someone to do something that's not their genius.
Nice. Very cool. Eric, any other questions before we get into checking out? We're listening to an episode where Harry interviewed Gary Leland.
Nope, I'm good. Let's jump into it.
All right. So what we do here is we usually play the first couple of minutes. And so we have a 2-minute clip here. And this was a special episode because this was your 300th episode. So this is...
No, it's 3-year episode.
3-year episode. Thank you. So here's the first 2 minutes and 13 seconds of that.
I would tie a string to my big toe and hang the string out the window And when it was time to go to the beach in the morning, Robert and Doug and them would come yank on that string and wake my ass up.
Podcast Junkies, bonus episode, 3-year anniversary. A little late since the show launched in April of 2014, but when I heard this conversation, I knew I had to do something special with it. It's with podcasting veteran and incredible storyteller, and you'll know why in a second, Mr. Gary Leland. I don't want to get too much into any other regular show details, given that it is bonus, but I just want to thank every single person who's ever listened to the show, even if you only listened for a few seconds and you realized it wasn't for you, and you've been a loyal listener from day one, or you've jumped on board recently and you're a passionate super fan. Guys and gals, I cannot tell you how honored I am to continue to be doing this. I never thought I'd really thought about making it this far, or even having a 3-year celebration. There's so many stories, so much that has happened. It's crazy. I've actually built a business off of podcasting because I started Podcast Junkies. I've been to several conferences. I've made lifelong friends as guests, as fellow podcasters. The community is amazing. You are all amazing, and I really wanted to do something special. And it was past April, and I was like, oh man, what am I going to do? And then when I wrapped up this interview, I almost knew immediately that it was going to be this. So enjoy this conversation. It's truly an honor, and this is why exactly I do this show, because of moments like this. You'll know what I'm talking about. So without further ado, my 3-year anniversary celebration, my conversation with podcast legend and just all around amazing guy, Gary Leland. So Gary Leland, Hall of Fame podcaster, thank you for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
So that was the first 2 minutes leading up to the interview. And Eric, I'll let you go first. I usually go first. I'll let you go first.
I think it's great. The thing I love most about the beginning of the show is that you jump right into the interview with Gary. You don't waste a whole lot of time. There's not a whole lot of housekeeping, not a whole lot of chit chat at the very beginning. I love the great, sincere thanks you give your listeners for being part of the 3 years and the 140 or 50 episodes that you have. I thought that was really sincere. It wasn't smarmy, and it wasn't you didn't overstay your welcome. You just hit it and you went running. I love the clip at the beginning. I think the clip from Gary that you pull out about the string on his toe really generates some great curiosity for the show and sucks me into it. A lot of people put that highlight clip at the beginning, and it really serves no purpose. I thought yours really created some great curiosity leading into the interview, because you were wondering what the heck that was all about as we jump into it. The electronic voice you have at the beginning, I've now heard it 3 times and I still don't know what it says. It's hard for my ears to pick that out. But those are my thoughts my 4 thoughts about the intro itself. Dave, how about you?
What he's saying is Harry's network, which is Podcastica.
Yeah.
Podcastica.
Yeah.
Right.
Let me, here we go.
Play it again.
Hmm?
All right. See, originally I thought it was podcast to go. And I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense.
I'm not. What is the whip snap? It's a little bondage sounding. I'm not sure what's going on with that.
And this whip you and then shock you. I don't know what that was all about.
And I was like, what is that all about?
This is so surreal to listen to this and get feedback on it. Shout out to Jason Kabasi, previous guest, host of the Walking Dead cast, and he founded Podcastica. And so after we interviewed each other, we kept talking, and I'd always wanted to be part of a network with someone that I had a good relationship with, and we just hit it off, and we sort of partnered together to try to add some more shows, and it's been slow going, but he's always doing interesting stuff, and so he came up with that little snippet, and it's I think it's meant to be someone who's like touching like a live wire, and they get shocked.
Okay, it's not sort of. It's not 50 more shades of grayer.
50 more shades.
50 more shades of orange.
Yes,
that's a whole different podcast.
Exactly.
That was a couple episodes ago, Dave.
But I'm with the thing that was interesting about this. How do you pick your guests? I know you talked about how sometimes you meet them, but like when you meet somebody, how do you determine, okay, this guy needs to come on the show, this woman needs to come and share her story?
To be honest, it's people that I've just already had a fun conversation with, and I just want to keep talking to them.
Okay.
You know, and I mean, granted, people like Gary and early guests, I was just curious to see if I could. I'm fascinated with the history of podcasting. So early on, you know, I reached out to you, Dave. Naturally, I spoke to Eric. I've spoken to Elsie. I've spoken to, you know, Rob Walsh, Daniel J. Lewis. Just so many fascinating podcasters. I just wrapped up a conversation a couple of weeks ago with Pat Flynn finally, because I wanted to wait till I had gotten to know him a little better, and we had ran into each other a couple of times. So essentially, like, I want the listener to not feel like this is a forced conversation. We've all heard them, like, these people don't know each other. It's really awkward, like, you know, and you feel like the host is just struggling to get through the interview. And there's that different shift when it's your friends or people you know and you're listening. I just heard two friends of mine. One friend is a host and the other friend is the guest, and I just had a smile on my face. It was like, oh, it's listening to my friends just hang out, and that's sort of the feeling. And so that's in the back of my mind when I'm at these conferences, and I do meet some people, and I'm like, you know, we just don't hit it off, and I'm like, I don't want to make it feel like I'm chasing them down. But there's ones that, you know, like, you're up until the late night at the bar, and just like, oh, it's just so much fun. And then when I reach out to them, they're like, yes, I'm so excited, and inevitably I just restock up on them at every conference.
Okay.
You make a good point there, Harry. You said that you're fascinated with the history of podcasting, and that's what makes a great interviewer, is a high level of curiosity. And that was what I jotted down in my notes. And my one big takeaway from this entire interview is your fantastic level of curiosity as you sit there and you listen to Gary tell his stories. You didn't chime in often, but when you did, it completely demonstrated not only your level of curiosity, but your level of awareness in listening to what he was telling you, and being genuinely interested in what he was saying, that you were asking fantastic follow-up questions that helped him guide his story and tell it in much greater detail. That was my favorite thing about the entire interview. The whole hour and a half of it was your level of curiosity and being able to drag great details out of him and help him tell his story. I thought it was great.
Yeah, and the thing that was cool is you kept getting like really cool bumper stickers. Like here, I thought this was cool. This is something that you said.
Yeah, I think they say that perfect is the enemy of done. And a lot of people just try to get that last, you know, T crossed and that I dotted. And to your point, they waste so much time in that final 10%. They could be using that brain power to create and come up with new ideas and let someone else be the finisher.
So perfect is the enemy of done, which then Larry?
I love Larry Geeland.
Yeah. Gary then ping-ponged it right back at you.
But, you know, my saying really is you can't start improving until you start doing.
Yeah.
And so it's stuff like that, as much as that, you know, that one's fun because it rhymes. It's still stuff that I was like, yeah, you know what? So it was just natural. That was the other cool thing. There was somewhere in the middle towards the end when Gary's talking about having closets in the gun. Apparently my brain is not going to show up tonight. Guns in the closet. Yeah. And he then mentions about how his dad, he'd be in the car with his dad, and his dad had a gun on the passenger side, and you just chimed in and said, yeah, I think things have changed a little bit. And so it was that kind of like, you know, you're letting him talk, but you just that little like, hey, let's throw in a little, and to me that made me laugh. Yeah. So I really love the conversation. Then the other thing I thought you did really well, and we'll talk about wallpaper here in a second, but instead of saying, tell me about your wife, that would be a generic, open-ended, where's this going to go? You asked that question this way.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on having a wife at the time that was game enough to go door to door and try to sell these blinds. And talk a little bit about your relationship with your wife and how long you'd been married at that point.
So I thought it was cool that you're bringing his relationship with his wife into the story that you're already in, so you can keep moving through the wallpaper area. But it wasn't just like, so tell me about your wife, to where he goes, she was in, I met her in Oklahoma. She likes to sew, some sort of weird. It's like, no, tell me specifically, how did she deal with this part of your life? And I was like, that was a cool question, because it kept the story moving, but it brought in a new piece. So I got to know more about Gary while still moving the wallpaper piece along.
Yeah, that's a great demonstration of your curiosity there, because you don't just simply ask him about his wife. It was, okay, wait a minute, you're going door to door, the two of you. Gary tells this story how they're going door to door selling window blinds, and because this was back in the, I don't know, late 70s, early 80s, whenever it was. And they would park and they'd walk down one side of the street looking for houses that had sheets on the windows, and they'd go knock on the door and sell them window blinds, and then walk back up the other side of the street. And the fact that you had the curiosity enough to say, how in the world did you convince her to do that? Like, that's a great question. Even the whole wallpaper story, though it was a little long and it kind of esoteric, it showed Gary's background and his history and kind of where he come from. I would have liked to have seen you turn that wallpaper story maybe into a relation of, if I'm starting a business today, or if how did you use what you learned selling blinds door to door to what you're doing on your podcast now, and how times change. You did show a great point of curiosity in there when you talked about you're selling wallpaper. Like, has the wallpaper industry really changed? Have there been wallpaper innovations? Like, and because that's a great question. And Gary says, well, yeah, there's been a ton of wallpaper innovations, and he actually names like 3 of them. And I was like, holy crud, I didn't realize that. But that was a great curiosity question, and you were pulling those out right and left through the entire episode.
Yeah, I just think it's so. I mean, for me, it's a matter of being curious. And I think if I'm genuine in my curiosity, then it's the listeners curious as well. And I think I'm obviously asking the questions they can't ask. So I just try to pay attention, like laser focus on what they're saying, as opposed to thinking, there's always that part of you, like, what can the next question be? But they'll give you something if you listen closely enough. And like every single guest gives you something that you're just like, you want to tease apart. It's just the kid in you is like, what does that mean? Like, and that's where that comes from.
I think the fact that you're a podcast editor kind of puts a little confidence in you that you can go edit out if something takes a left turn. Yeah. And I think that gives you a little more courage to ask the curious questions and ask the questions that may not work. If you're just an regular podcaster and not as confident in your editing skills, you might not ask that question, because wallpaper's been the same for 50 years. I hadn't done anything. Well, now you're gonna have to go edit that answer out, because you didn't know where it was going, but you got a fantastic answer out of him.
That's a good point.
Yeah, the only thing I had about the wallpaper story was that you went fairly deep into the weeds, and at one point he's talking about how much stock he has and the book he has, and I'm like, is this like how to start a wallpaper store? Kind of like, we were really deep into that.
How much a wallpaper book costs? Like, a wallpaper book costs $100, and you have about 100 of them, and there's about 100 pages in the book. And Home Depot used to carry this brand, and I was like, holy moly, where are we going with this?
There's something about, and maybe it's something I need to work on, but just when I'm speaking to someone who I consider an elder statesman, this idea about being respectful and respecting your elders. I don't know. So I think a little bit of that might have come into play.
Well, definitely. And with Gary, it's so easy, because you just launch Gary a softball, and away, and no pun intended, Gary. Yeah. But it just, he takes it and he runs with it. He's fantastic.
The last thing you want to do is launch him a softball.
You're right. Right. Then we're on to his softball site. But, he's great. I love him. And he tells fantastic stories. And he's got such a,
oh my God,
a crazy background. Everything from the guns to the surfboards to the fact that he played, what's his name, in chess. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah. Was it Bobby Fischer?
Bobby Fischer. He played Bobby Fischer in chess. Like Gary Leland. Oh,
it's amazing. Like, I knew none of this.
Play 6 Degrees of Gary Leland. Holy crap, he knows everybody.
Well, that's it. And every time you turn around, you'd hear something like this.
And I mean, I got trounced in the water, just pushed under there by the waves. And when I came up, my wetsuit was just filled with water. It had all come down my neck and stuff. And it was just tons of water that I could hardly swim with all the weight. And I swam. I remember this to this day. I swam and I swam and I swam. I must have been about 16, 15. And I'm going, man, I'm not going to make it. I really am thinking I'm not going to make it to shore. I'm wearing out. I never was a strong swimmer, but I was okay. I was good enough, but I never have been an Olympic quality swimmer. And finally, my feet are starting to sink, because I'm getting more worn out. And all of a sudden, I'm like going, oh, my God, I can't believe that. I'm thinking I'm going to drown, and my feet touch bottom.
Oh,
I'm
man.
close enough on my feet to touch the ground.
So I was just like, what other podcast you're going to hear Gary Leland talk about almost drowning to death?
Right.
So the thing I like, I don't know if do you have your questions like written out ahead of time or?
I have a couple of points. And with Gary, there's so much stuff that he's done. It's like, man, I could have 100 questions if I really sat down to it. And I was like, I don't want to be biased. And he's talked, it's funny because he came on and he thought we could do half an hour. I was like, no, sorry, Gary. It's an hour. And he's like, oh, okay. And it seems like I was like, what kind of guy is this asking me for an hour? So I think what was great is at some point we had gone past an hour and he's like, we're still talking. And he was just like having a blast. He's like laid back at this point, like in his chair because we were doing video. So I sort of knew he'd give me enough to go on. But, if it's someone that there's 1 or 2 questions that I've always wanted to ask them, then I'll do that. But I think if, I try to have a lot of it come from the actual conversation. It's a bit of a high wire act sometimes because, if you don't get anything, then you're like, where am I going to take this?
Well,
and the fact that you get to the end and he says, I told you an hour and it's been an hour and a half, so I must have had a good time. So I think during that whole thing, he pays you one of the best compliments ever that an interviewer can get. And he tells that story about the gun and how he found the gun when he was 5 or 6 under the seat, and he points it at his buddy and he pulls the trigger, but the safety was on and luckily it didn't go off. And I was like, holy cow, what a story. And then he says, the thing he says is, I don't think I've ever told that story to anyone, which is
my wife, he said, I think.
Yeah. He said, I don't even think I've told my wife that story, which is probably the best compliment an interview can ever get, is that you're getting your guests so comfortable and asking such amazing questions that they're telling you stuff they've never told anyone. And that's a powerful interview right there.
And that really shows you the level of calmness of he wasn't nervous. He was just kicking back with Harry. Because I love the fact that he then, we already talked about the guns thing, almost drowning, sneaking into sporting events. He said he snuck in with the Chicago Bears after the Super Bowl.
My 14-year-old son was listening to that with me, and he's like, I don't get it, Dad. How'd he do it? And I said, he just gave the ticket taker $50, and the ticket taker tore it. I go, no, he pretended he tore it like he was tearing a ticket. He just put the 50 in his pocket. And my son went, oh, it's like, now all of a sudden it's starting to click for him.
Yeah, I remember. And then
great story.
He was talking about pinball machines, and the thing that I was like wondering if your questions were pre-made. You asked a really cool one, which was number one, he was talking about something and you asked him, where were you at this time? I think when he was talking about the wallpaper. And so I thought that was a cool one because you never know. Because I thought, if he had said, oh, this is back when I was in North Carolina, well, now you can ask him, well, what was your childhood like or what? So I thought that was a cool, now it didn't go anywhere because it was in Texas or whatever, but I was like, oh, that was a cool, that could have gone somewhere. And then you asked him, what do you miss doing? And I'm like, there's a question I don't hear on any other podcast. And I'm like, there's, everybody has an answer to that. And usually you miss things. Well, obviously, if you miss them, you like them. Because like you don't miss, I miss my dog that used to bite me and I had to go. No, you don't miss things that you hate. You miss things that you loved, which means you've got a story right there. And I was like, man, that is a great question. So that was the thing. As I listened to this, I'm like, I'm going to have a hard time finding something, that this, you can tweak that and tweak that. So your questions were really good because most of them led to either a story or a feeling or basically a story based on a feeling. So like that one's based on something that you miss. And I'm like, that's a really good question.
I don't even think I remember asking it. I think it just came up in the moment. I think it was in the context of him doing all the stuff that he's done, and that was it about which specifically of all the things that he's done does he miss?
I think so. It was right after he was talking about pinballs,
Okay.
Pinball machines and something like that. And you just threw in there, well, what do you miss doing? And I think that's when he got into surfing.
Okay.
Which is weird to kind of picture Gary Leland, because I only know Gary for 10 years, but I don't see him on a surfboard. Yeah. It's hard to picture young Gary Leland. And
that's kind of the thing through the whole episode, Harry, is that you're asking great questions and you're getting Gary to tell great stories. And the thing that Gary loves about your interview with him is the fact that it's not your typical Gary Leland interview. You're not talking about the nuts and bolts of podcasting and that sort of thing. But I would have liked to have heard a few more of those questions tossed in here and there. Because at the beginning, he was talking about wallpaper and his wallpaper business. He's got like 23 websites and he does the softball thing. I would have liked to have heard a little more about what podcasts he does and which ones he enjoys most, or, does he have a podcast on the wallpaper business, and does it drive business? I would have liked to have heard just a little of that. Not in depth. We don't have to touch on it, but as he's telling the wallpaper story and how it ebbed and flowed, and now he's only one of 3 that do it in Dallas because Home Depot basically killed the whole industry. Does he have a podcast that helps drive that business, or did it help him maintain what he needed to, or did it help him make the transition to a web-based business or something like that? Toward the end, you ask him something like, do you remember a mentor who influenced you to get into business? And you asked a couple good business questions like that, but it was in the last third of the interview. It was in that last 30 minutes. And I would have liked to have seen a little more of that sprinkled throughout the show. But that's really the only thing I would have tweaked. I don't want you to go too far in that direction, because then you just become like every other podcast interview and you're just talking all podcasting. I love the fact that you get him to bring out, the fact that he's a chess player and a surfer and loves guns and that kind of thing. Has he ever thought about doing if he did a podcast on chess playing, what would that look like? Or some sort of just touch on podcasting every now and then to remind me that we're listening to Podcast Junkies and that he's a podcaster. And then we can continue ebbing and flowing through Gary's life story. But that was just one tweak I would have liked to have seen.
Yeah,
very good point.
The only tweak that came to me was at the very beginning. And this was it. You just got done, doing your thank you for all my episodes, my 3 years, and yada, yada, yada. And you started off the interview with this.
Yeah, glad to be here. Nice to be here. We had a hard time making this work, Harry, but we finally got the time figured out.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of times if you're not clear about expectations, then people maybe come and they may not know that there's going to be video, or they may not know how long it's going to be. But every time I do it, I learn a little bit. I learned something else about how I can better communicate to my guests. So when they get here, they're not surprised. I think because the last thing you want is a surprise when you're showing up as a guest on someone's show.
Completely agree.
So it's not a big deal. It's a 30-second clip out of an hour and a half show. But you introduced him. He said, "Hey, it's great to be here." And right after that clip, you got into your first question. And I'm like, we could have skipped the whole "hey, it was a bitch to get you scheduled" kind of section and just going back to the question. Other than that, I didn't really hear anything. It was funny in a way, especially at the end, that once Gary was rolling, I think he was going through the Rolodex of what else do I got in here? Oh yeah, my dad used,
Well, at one point in time, Gary says, "Well, it sounds like we're just telling stories now, so I got another one for you." And he just rolls into that. I think that was rolling into the gun story. We had a gun in every house. We had a gun in every closet. We had guns everywhere. My mom had a gun on her nightstand, and my dad had a gun on his nightstand, and they were loaded. I was like, "Holy crud!"
Yeah, it was me.
That's growing up in the South, right there.
Yeah,
I think one of the things that this feedback is amazing and very helpful, because I pride myself on saying, it's free flowing and anything goes and we can talk about anything, and I've left some silly mistakes in there. I'm like, look, and I've gotten feedback that some podcasters say, "Wow, man, you really don't edit, and you really make me feel like much more comfortable about being, real with what's out there. And I'm like, yeah, and maybe my show's different, and I have the luxury of doing that. And if the dog's barking, I'm like, I don't care. If the fire engine goes by, I don't care. Like, hey, I'm not NPR. I'm not in a studio. I'm in my home, in my home office, and real stuff happens. And so I've kind of had that feeling of like, for the new podcaster, so they can at least hear a show that I take my sound seriously, but all the other stuff around. I mean, at some point you just have to like roll with the punches. So I just have to walk that fine line. And to Eric's point about bringing it back to podcasting, because it is Podcast Junkies. So I think I lose track of that sometimes. I get sucked into the stories.
Yeah. Well, in your notes, you said that you wanted it to be like inside the actor's studio, but for podcasting, and it feels like that. It has that sort of vibe. It's a very, very comfortable storytelling sort of podcast, and I really enjoyed that about it. That's what I love about your show, is that you have the knack of getting people to tell great stories, and that's what makes great entertainment, and that's what I love about it.
And I always wonder, because most of the time Harry's interviewing somebody that I have met, because I'm at the same conference as he is, but it's the interviews when he brings on somebody and I go, I have no idea, I've never heard of this person. That's when I go, you know what, I still like this show, because usually there's some sort of story, or that's why I asked, how do you pick your guest? Because usually there's something there that's kind of fun. And I think one of my favorite episodes, in fact, I left Harry some feedback about this. He was interviewing Lee Silverstein from the Colon Cancer Podcast, and I was out in the woods listening to this. And he would say something, and I'm like, oh, I hope Harry asked this question. And he would. And then there's another one, and I'm like, oh, and so he was doing a great job of asking, like, he was in my shoes. And it was just, again, showed his great listening skills. And I learned more about my friends on Harry's show than I do any other show.
That's a great soundbite.
It is. That's why
you're actually talking to them.
Yeah, exactly. So now
I feel like I wanted to start the show. Hi, this is Dave Jackson, and I actually learned more about my friends on listening to.
I will do that. Yeah, I'll make a soundbite. Then, if you throw on top of it, we're going to go ahead and we're going to skip over to your website here.
Okay.
And
do you have the closing of the show, Dave?
I do. Should we do that first, and then?
Yeah, let's do that, and then go over to the website.
All right. So that, and here again, it's pretty simple. It goes a little something like this.
So not much else to say there. Just that, what an amazing conversation. Again, there was we did a video Skype, so I'm just sitting there watching, like my mouth is open and reacting, and you can see that he's getting into it. And part of it, when the sound is low, is him stepping back, relaxing, and sharing stories that he hasn't shared before. So it's everything a podcaster could dream about. And I'm just so honored that he came on board. Stay tuned next week. We are back on track with episode 129. Lee Silverstein, another amazing human being, doing great things with his podcast. Again, another conversation from Podfest. So that's coming up. We're back on track, but I just wanted to have this opportunity to sort of celebrate wins, which is something we don't tend to do a lot of. I know I tend to overlook them, and I didn't want to do it this time. So again, thank you. I know I said a lot in the intro, but just again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for listening. Thank you for continuing to listen. And I'm honored to have you as part of the Podcast Junkies family. If you haven't already joined us at Podcast Junkies on Facebook, my group just for listeners of the show, and not a place to spam stuff. Just saying. Love you guys.
And then Harry does my favorite pet peeve. Music for the sake of nothing, even if it is from Cedar and Soil, which I do remember. But the other thing that's really weird is this is usually where I switch to 2x. I love those two notes. So
I thought this music was going to end about 4 times. I'm like, oh, there's the end. Oh no, wait, it's still going. Oh, here's the end. No, wait, still going. Going.
So that would be my one feedback. And
I've seen podcasters play literally 2 or 3 minutes of a song. I'm like, really? Not that much?
I will say it to his phrase. Chris Coran plays an entire song at the end of his show, and I'm like, I don't care if it's Stairway to Heaven. I don't want to hear any song that often every week. It's like, hey, here it is. Like, but I understand why, and I know Jess from Interview Connections used to play a song as well. It was a brother. So in almost every case, it's somebody who has an emotional connection to the song. So I think with Chris, my guess is he probably either produced it, recorded it, or probably plays drums on it. Who knows? So I understand why they do it. I just hate the fact that I'm in the car looking for the skip, 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 skip button to get through the whole song. So,
Good point.
I was surprised again, and maybe we talked about this at the beginning, that you don't mention fullcast.co at all on your show.
Yeah.
And the only other thing that, and I don't know if this is the show for it, I learned more about you at Podcast Mid-Atlantic than I ever did from your show, which I guess is probably a good sign because the show's about your guest, not you.
Mm-hmm.
But I know very little about you from your show. So I don't know how, Eric, what are your thoughts on that?
I'd love to learn a little bit more about you, not necessarily making the show about you, but dropping in little tidbits here and there about who you are, what you do, what you love. That's how people are going to come to know, like, and trust you. And just a little bit will go a long way, especially if you have regular listeners and you just drop something in. Like listening to Dave's show, we know Dave plays guitar and we know Dave has a cat. You know, it's just things that come up in the show. So 2 things about the close for me. I love the fact that you tease Lee Silverstein coming up next week. I would have liked to have had give me a compelling reason to come back and listen to Lee. I don't know if you'd already had the interview recorded at that point in time. If you do, Lee's going to tell us how he did blank. If you don't already have it recorded, I can't wait to ask Lee how he blanks. You know, tease me with something. A tease, there's a difference between a promotion and a tease. Promotion just says, next week, Lee Silverstein. See you then. A tease actually creates some excitement and some anticipation that, man, I need to come back for next week's episode. So give me something that leaves that desire within me to come back and listen because I can't miss it. Create some fear of missing out. The other thing, in your notes, you said your goal is to get people to subscribe to the podcast, and you don't mention that at all. You say, go check us out on Facebook. That's just for listeners of the show. So I would maybe incorporate the subscribe to the show. Find links at podcastjunkies.com or something like that. If that's truly your goal is to get people to subscribe to the show, make that a call to action in there.
Yeah, I've recently got a free PDF of like 8 tools I've used to build my show, and so now it's podcastjunkies.com/8tools
Cool.
to get people on the mailing list.
That'd be great. Yeah, I saw that when I went over to your website, which is a very nice segue to checking out your website.
Yeah, the thing
you don't have segue music?
No. I didn't remember Cedar and Soil, so you're doing a good job on.
I don't even know what that means. What is Cedar and Soils?
That is his.
What am I missing?
That does his music.
The producer who did my music, I met him in a mastering class in New York City, and I said, "Hey, can you record a little jingle for me?" And he made it. And it was so quirky. I was like, "Yeah, I'll use it," and because I knew you needed unique music, and it's been going strong ever since. I don't think he ever.
Cedar and Soils, is that his business name or is that his name? Is that his DJ name?
It's kind of his band name. He's an amazing musician, George Abiana, and it's Cedar Soil, his website, cedarsoil.com, and he goes by Cedar and Soil. I think Cedar Tree he's from Lebanon, and I think there's some relevance with the Cedar Tree, but he plays all the instruments on his songs. It's amazing, like drums, sings, piano, like
wow. Really. The other thing I wanted to ask, one of the things you do at the end of your show, and I've always wondered about this, you do a retention hashtag, and where it'll be like, if you've made it this far to the end of the show, thank you so much for listening. If you like the show, please tweet it. I'm at Podcast Junkies, Gary's at whatever, hashtag, wallpaper something, guns in the closet, whatever the hashtag is. When you go back and check those, like, is it more than you thought, less than you thought? Because I've always wondered, like, are people actually, because I know I do on occasion, if I'm not in the car, I'm like, all right, what was that again? Hashtag she's so cool. Okay. How does that?
It's so funny. So shout out to Jesse Lawler, early guest of Smart Drug Smarts. He has a feature on his show. So I ripped it off from him. He calls it the Ruthless Retention Gimmick. And he teases out like an article or something he's going to mention. I'll talk about this at the end of the show, and you're like, oh, okay, this is cool. Like I want to listen. And he uses that to hook people. And I was like, well, what can I do that's related to that, and I just thought of making something. It's like a little Easter egg. Addie Saucedo's been doing this in her new podcast, Planner Podcast. She just waits till the song ends, and then there's a brief silence, and I'm always fascinated because I'm listening. I'm like, is there something? Is there something there? And she does a quote or something like that. So I've been at those cool little Easter eggs. The super fans listen to them. There's about maybe 3 to 5 people that use it, and I call them the super fans. Shout out to Patrick and Quessy, like clockwork. You just see them. They know they almost know that they have to do it now because they've done it so many times. But it's fun. It's just like a little something to do to have a little bit of fun with your show.
Identify the super fans. Well, the thing that I really liked about your website, and because I'm looking at this on an app, is your show notes are insane. I mean, they're really, really cool because, first of all, the website's nice and clean.
It's almost like you had a pro do it.
I do, actually.
Yeah, exactly. But I love the fact you might want to remove the clamor button because that's not.
Yeah, I keep forgetting to do that.
But I love the fact you've got subscribe buttons and share buttons because it seems like is that smart?
Yeah,
player?
Honeymore Smart Simple Podcast.
Simple Podcast. Okay, yeah, because I know you've got the links to subscribe as well as a link to share. So I thought that was cool. But when you get down here to what was covered, I love the fact that you put in timestamps. And here's why I think these are cool. As someone who just binge watched whatever the name of that show is on Netflix that we're talking about, Stranger
Things. Yeah,
is if you binge watch any show on Netflix now, when it starts to play the episode, when the intro comes up, Netflix now gives you a button if you're watching on your PC or someplace, skip intro. And yes. I love the fact that I can skip the intro and I'm like, that's it. I'm putting in time codes when I can into all my shows because it sounds stupid to go, I skipped a 30-second intro, but you feel like it's just a convenience. So I really like the fact that I can see what's coming in the interview, so I can see things like pinball machines, what attracted him to Kathy. So you're not giving away the answer. Yeah. You're giving away more or less what the content was. So I thought that was really cool. And then I mentioned earlier how you have these bumper stickers, and you have bumper stickers set for people to come and tweet out. And so, yeah, I thought that was really cool. And plus you have all the links, which is really, to me, what good show notes are. They let people know what's in the show. If you want, you can give them something to tweet out, and then any links that you mentioned should be in the show. Other than that, I don't know what else you would put in a show note. You've got a nice graphic at the top as well, and then your links to follow you and ways to contact you and things of that nature. So I just looked at this and was like, wow, this is like a great example of like, here's what your show notes should look like. I really couldn't find anything. I have to
give another shout out to the team that I'm working with, Alex and Jeanette from Planted in Miami, who I met at Podfest. We hit it off, and they're the ones helping me with that, and they just do such an amazing job, and we get along so well. So it's been a nice partnership.
Yeah. Eric, anything else to chime in on the website?
I love the website. Going through it, I found nothing that I would change. I love the fantastic clean look. The play buttons on every single episode were big and easy to find. The social links are huge, and I love that. Those are great. The thing I love about the show notes is we just talked about the tease at the end of your episode. What we covered here, these are perfect teases. It's why wallpaper business fell from grace and what took its place and its resurgence is a perfect tease. It tells me, it entices me to go listen to that part. What it's like working with his wife, Kathy, tells me exactly. It leads me into the conversation. It's, oh man, I got to figure out what that is. I don't want to miss out. His childhood and growing up with guns. It doesn't tell me which side of the fence he's on. Doesn't tell me anything about it. It just entices me, piques my interest to go click on it. And I love that about your show notes. I love the tweetables. The contact page, the thing I loved about your contact page was, there's all sorts of ways you can contact us. Here's 3 of them. You can email us. You can fill out this form down here. You can go find us on Facebook or any of the social media platforms. Those were great. The one thing that that it's just part of your theme, is when I originally pulled up podcastjunkies.com, the frame came up, but the content didn't. It took a minute for the episodes to populate, which is part of the theme because they kind of fade in. But when I went to it, I'd sat there for a second and I was like, oh, crud, is it not going to load? And then it came up and I was like, oh, okay, here it is. So it's just what it does. And even when I'm on, like, if I'm on an episode page here, if I'm on the Gary Leland episode page and I click the Podcast Junkies logo at the top, it goes back, it shows the framework, and there's the episodes. You know, it's that there's that delay there, which kind of spooked me at first. Now I'm used to it, but I thought at the first it wasn't going to load. But overall, I love the website. I think it's a clean look. I love your yellow and black. You know, studies show that those are the two most powerful colors together that stand out against everything else, which I think is very cool. You made it look great. I love your fonts. I love it all. Love it, love it, love it.
The only thing I found that I would go that was maybe missing is your about page is kind of about you.
It's old. I just realized that.
But I don't see much about, like, here's how it, you know, I experienced the New Media Expo. I don't see much here about the show. Like, here's what, you know, I continue to line up interviews, but in terms of, like, you know, here's why I started the show. So I would have, like, here's, you know, about the show, and then about Harry Duran.
Okay.
And you know, and if you wanted, like, history of the show, then you could put this kind of stuff. But that was the only thing I was like, oh, wait, where's the, like, because the about page actually is one of the more trafficked pages on it. But other than that, I was like, I just love the fact that giant play buttons everywhere you turn around. I'm like, okay.
Yes, indeed.
I don't think people have to go, is this a podcast website? No, I don't think you have to ask that.
I recently switched it over from a site that I started with, just a simple theme. I think it was called the Ribbon theme. And then this is Divi. It feels like it could be faster. It seems like a bit sluggish. So I'm always playing around with it, but it's just one of those rabbit holes that it's amazing.
The website's never done. That's, that's a given. So, but so in general, I was telling Eric before you caught on, I'm like, I really had a hard time finding really anything, you know, like I said, the one little thing at the beginning where you're talking about the scheduling thing, I'm like, I would have taken that out. The about page. But other than that, you know, well, you know this, I listen to your show every week.
Yeah.
So I'm already a listener. But you know, Eric, any thoughts as we kind of wrap things up here?
I'm with Dave. There wasn't a whole lot to pick apart. You know, I was even hesitant to tell you to add more about podcasting into it because I don't want you to change your style and I don't want to ruin the natural curiosity and conversation that you have, getting your guests to tell the great stories that they tell. That's what I love about your show. But if there was a way to just tweak it a hair to make it a little better, just to make it overall we're talking to podcasters and their stories around the podcast world, just a trickle here or there would kind of keep that common theme from interview to interview, but continue. I love the stories about surfing that Gary tells, and I love the stories about playing chess and how he went up to the guy on the cruise ship that was beating all the kids and played him, and he hasn't played in 30 years. And I mean, those are great stories, but so that's why I was hesitant to even bring that up. That would be the only thing I would tweak. Everything else, keep that fantastic level of curiosity. That's what's going to continue to make you a great interviewer.
Thank you.
Yeah, whatever you do, don't start talking about gear.
Yes.
No, don't make it that show.
Okay.
But any questions as we start to wrap things up here from you, Harry?
No, I mean, I just, you know, it was really strange to just sit back and listen. I always tell people you should be listening to your own episodes, but even, you know, to have people as a group listening, there's just a different feeling. Like I recently had a client I was helping and he had friends over his house and he said, okay, he actually played an episode for everyone out loud. And so it kind of harkens back to that old time radio. So I thoroughly enjoyed this experience and I had a lot of fun. And I think there's always room for improvement. And just I've got a couple of notes here, some interesting feedback and some reminders. You know, things like updating the about page, and even like thinking I was already doing something good with what I call my open loop at the end, but Eric's feedback on making it more of a tease is extremely helpful for me, and it's going to be helpful for my clients as well.
Great. Glad we could help.
Awesome. Well, Eric, where can people find you?
Oh, you can always find me over at podcasttalentcoach.com. All of my tools and worksheets and helpful information right there for you anytime you'd like.
And of course, we've already mentioned it, but you can find Harry over at podcastjunkies.com and wherever fine podcasts are given away for free. You can find me at schoolofpodcasting.com. And if you'd like to be in the seat where Harry is right now, simply go over to podcastreviewshow.com/review me. And there are 2 different versions of being reviewed. If you're in a time zone that you don't really want, usually we do these in the evening. If you can't really meet that kind of time zone, feel free to order the light version where it's just me and Eric, and we will review your show without you. Or you can do the full review, which is what Harry opted for tonight, and you can come on live and ask us questions, et cetera, et cetera. So thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you again real soon with another episode of the Podcast Review Show.